Hello, everybody. After a long hiatus, Schedule School is back. I apologise for the delay. Amongst other things, I decided to get married, and then I have been focusing somewhat on the day job. The focus of today is on the element of schedules that I personally find the most difficult, and that's pensions. If you haven't watched Schedule School before, I would recommend visiting our website, www.scheduleschool.co.uk, so that you can have a little browse at how this works. In essence, we follow a case study throughout, and that is of Penny Foster. She's a primary school teacher who was injured in a road traffic accident and rendered paraplegic. Using this scenario, we work through schedules one head of loss at a time. And in each seminar, we are guided through worksheets by very experienced practitioners in the field. If you don't fancy spending today, understandably, sitting and watching all of our previous seminars, then I would recommend that you briefly go over the last one, which was William Latimer, Tyack KC, looking at loss of earnings. Today is part one of two. We are doing pensions. I've just said how difficult those are. And for that reason, we're going to split it into principles. And then in the next seminar, we'll be looking at the calculations for Penny's case as a primary school teacher. I'm here today for the introduction, but today in the main is going to be hosted by my colleague, Alexander Mellis. Alex sits in the employment and personal injury groups in Chambers, and he has a particular interest in cases where those two lap over, which is why I felt he was perfectly placed to talk to us about loss of earnings and about pensions. Alongside that, if you have any queries about costs, then Alex is the one to ask, as he is the author of A Practical Guide to Personal Injury Fixed Costs in Portal and Ex-Portal Cases, a book which I personally rely on frequently. You may have seen that we have been very lucky with speakers recently, and today is no exception. It is a bit of a number 5 love-in, as we are joined by Tyack KC. David is a personal injury and clinical negligence practitioner, and he has a notable and well-established practice specialising in high-value, complex and catastrophic cases. And in keeping with that, David was nominated for Clinical Negligence Silk of the Year in this year's Legal 500 Awards. And I can tell you from experience that if anybody knows about pensions, it's David. So with that, I'll hand over to Alex and David. Please do remember that Schedule School is a free resource hosted by juniors and guided by seniors. If you do find today's seminar useful and you wish to contribute anything in return, then we'd always be grateful for any donation to the wonderful Spinal Injuries Association. So Alex and David, I'll hand over to you.
So obviously, David, we've got here our agenda slide. And as I understand it, we're doing this in 2 parts. So today we're just going to cover the overall overarching concepts of it all.
Yes, that's right, Alex. We realised when I'd done the slides that there was so much detail to cover that we wouldn't do it in 45 minutes. So today is really about dealing with the basic principles, and we'll do the calculation in relation to the specific example in part 2 of this talk.
So I suppose that leads us on to the first question. How easy are pension claims to do?
Well, my advice is that they can appear daunting. They can involve complex arithmetic, the incidence of taxation, splitting multipliers, discount factors, and so on. But don't be put off, because the principles, as we'll see hopefully, are pretty straightforward. It's just that the exercise of calculating the claim can be quite labour intensive. To make your task easier, just remember that if you're doing a schedule, you can say where you've estimated something. So if, for example, you're getting bored of doing the tedious tax calculations on net pension claims, you can simply say this is an estimate of net equivalent of the pension lost. And in my experience, the other side will agree your arithmetic in the schedule or the counter schedule. But the important thing is that you make clear when you are estimating. And as long as you do, then you haven't done anything wrong. The other thing I would say is don't be put off doing the claim, because they are worth doing. As we'll see in this claim, where the injured claimant had a defined contribution, a defined benefit scheme under the teacher's pension scheme, the claim is worth something like £670,000 for loss of pension alone. But where the claim is in relation to loss of contributions to a more common defined contribution scheme, the claim can still run into tens or even hundreds of thousands of pounds. So you can't just ignore these claims on the basis that they're difficult.
So I suppose from what you just said leads us to the next question. What are the main types of pension that we have to be dealing with in these sorts of claims?
So the main types of pension are defined benefit and defined contribution.
What are those?
Okay, well, it's important you understand the difference between the two, because an understanding of how these schemes work is absolutely essential to making the claim. If you don't understand them, you simply can't make the claim. So a defined benefit scheme is the more traditional pension scheme that we've seen over years past. They're being phased out in the public sector, and indeed they're pretty rare now. They're being phased out in the private sector, and they're pretty rare now in the private sector, but they're being retained in the public sector. The vast majority of defined benefit schemes in the public sector are provided to employees like teachers, doctors, nurses, police, firefighters, members of the armed forces, members of the civil service, local government employees. And what the defined benefit scheme does is it provides the employee with a guaranteed income on retirement. It's not dependent on the growth of any fund or anything like that. It's a covenant between you and the pension provider that you'll get a fixed amount guaranteed upon retirement. And the income that you're guaranteed to get is calculated by reference to a formula, usually connected to the employee's salary and the number of years served in employment.
And so I suppose this is the flip side.
Yeah, so a defined contribution scheme, of which private schemes now form the vast majority, are simply funds to which defined contributions are made by you and your employer every year. The fund is invested in the usual investment vehicles such as shares and gilts. And importantly, the fund can go up and down. As we've seen in the last few weeks of economic turmoil, after the announcement of the mini budget, the markets lost confidence, and the Bank of England had to buy bonds from the British government simply to keep these private pension schemes afloat. Needless to say, they've lost a lot of value in a matter of weeks. So these schemes can go up as well as down. They are risky. At retirement, the fund to which you contributed and your employer has contributed pays out an annual pension, which is referable to the size of the fund. As I say, the majority of pensions now are defined contribution, and generally almost all private employers provide defined contribution schemes. They've moved out from the defined benefit scheme sector.
So what are the pros and cons of each scheme, I suppose?
So the defined benefit scheme, I would describe, whatever anyone else tells you, as overwhelmingly advantageous to the employee and overwhelmingly disadvantageous to the employer. So far as the employee is concerned, for a fixed contribution from their gross salary, for example, a teacher on £35,000 a year will contribute 8.9% of their gross salary. the employee is guaranteed index linked an income on retirement. And the word contribution is a misnomer because usually it's not contributing to a pension fund as such. It is the levy that the government charges you for the privilege of being a member of this scheme. And what you get at the end is dependent not on years served, forgive me, not on the growth of any fund, but on years served and the level of salary that you've enjoyed over the course of the membership of the scheme. So, for example, you may get a teacher paying 8.6% on £35,000, which is equivalent to a contribution of £3,010 per annum. That teacher may, depending on time served, get a guaranteed retirement income of, say, £20,000 index linked. To give you another example, in the case we're going to discuss in our sample of Penny Foster, roughly she's been a member, or she would have been a member of the teacher's pension scheme for about 43 years, had she not had the accident. If it's assumed roughly that she contributed 9% of her average salary of, say, £38,000 over those 43 years to her pension scheme, then she's contributed about £3,500 per annum. So over 43 years, she'll have contributed about £150,000 to be a member of the scheme. At age 65, she'll get about £37,000 index linked per annum. And if she lives for 23 years, that means she gets a total payment of about £851,000. Now that's a return on what she's contributed of about 550% guaranteed. And that's before you even take into account index linking. So you can see that it's vastly advantageous to the employee. By contrast, it's very disadvantageous to the employer because the employer is locked into this scheme whereby the employer is bound to pay the employee this sum of money for as long as they live. So on to defined contributions. They are significantly disadvantageous to the employee and significantly advantageous to the employer. The disadvantages to the employee are that there is no guaranteed retirement income. The retirement income is a direct function of how much has been contributed to the fund and by how much the fund has grown. It can go up as well as down. And as we've seen in recent weeks, billions can be wiped off a fund held for a group of employees within a matter of days. The advantages to the employer are that all the employer has to do is contribute a set percentage of gross earnings to a pension fund until the employee retires. Once the employee has retired, the employer has no further obligations to the employee. And the scheme is therefore very significantly cheaper for the employer. And that's why so many private employers have pulled out of defined benefit schemes.
So what's an example of a defined contribution scheme then?
So under the Pensions Act 2008, all employers now have to enroll their employees on a pension scheme that satisfies the minimum requirements of the Act. And essentially, unless your client is a public employee on a defined benefit scheme, it is likely that they will be a member of a Pensions Act 2008 compliant scheme. They have the option of opting out, but very few employees take that option in my experience. And the minimum requirements of the scheme, and again, in my experience, most employers abide by the minimum requirements and don't give more than they need to, are as follows. Between them, the employer and the employee must together contribute 8% of so-called qualified earnings. And qualified earnings are defined as earnings above £6,240 and below £50,270 per annum. Now, of that 8%, the employer has to contribute at least 3%, and the employee has to make up the contributions so that the total contributions are 8%. The employee's contribution comes out of the employee's gross earnings. The employer's contribution is equivalent to a percentage of the gross earnings. It doesn't come out of the gross earnings on top of the employee's contribution. The annual contributions are invested into a fund, which, as I said, can go up or down. And at retirement, the employee is given an annual pension based on the fund value.
So how does the court, or does the court even take into account that future growth, particularly as it can obviously go up or down?
Well, the simple answer is that it doesn't. The general rule is that the court will not speculate on the future of inflation in relation to a pension fund. And the authority for that is Auty against National Coal Board, 1985. And the reason for that is simple. It would be impossible for a judge to speculate on future growth or future inflation. These are crystal ball gazing matters, which the best economists struggle to do. So the court will not speculate. And further, if you think about it, if the claimant wanted to argue that they've lost a defined contribution fund, which would have grown 5% per annum till they retire, then the response to that is, well, you're going to get damages for the loss of contributions to that fund. So if you're really confident that it will grow by 5%, you can invest your damages and get 5% in return. So the practical and the legal answer is that the court will not speculate on future growth of fund and will not assume any future growth of the fund.
So presumably, therefore, you don't need any expert evidence for that.
Indeed, that is absolutely the case. And in my experience, it's a common misconception amongst lawyers that they should get a report to report on the growth of a pension fund. It is simply inadmissible in practical and, in my view, on principle terms.
So how then do you actually get the loss for the defined contribution scheme? How do you calculate it?
So when calculating a loss of defined contribution scheme, you have to remember that the employee's contribution comes out of gross earnings. The employer's contribution does not, but it's defined as a percentage of gross earnings. So if you contribute 5% of gross earnings of £50,000, that 5% comes out of your gross earnings of £50,000. The employer doesn't take a further 3% out of your £50,000. The employer has to contribute separately 3%, which is equivalent to £50,000. And that's necessary to bear in mind when discussing the two basic methods of calculating the loss claim. So method one, it applies where, when calculating net loss of earnings, you've calculated net losses of earnings after deducting the employee's contribution and after deducting tax and national insurance. So you've already, as it were, stung the claimant for their pension contribution when calculating loss of earnings. And so having done that, the claimant is entitled to the benefit of a claim for those contributions when you come to calculate the pension loss claim. So imagine an example where the claimant was earning gross earnings of £30,000. Imagine the employee contributed 5% to pension and the employer contributed 3%. between them, they contribute 8%. So the annual pension loss is simply 8% of £30,000, which is £2,400. And the loss is calculated as a function thereafter of the number of years lost from the date of the accident to the date of retirement. So if there is 3 years between the accident and the date of settlement or judgment, then past losses of pension are 3 years times £2,400 per year, which is £7,200. If the claimant would have served a further 20 years in the future, from the date of settlement or judgment to the date of retirement, then future losses of pension fund are based on 20 years times £2,400, which amounts to £48,000, I think. But you have to bear in mind that you have to then discount that future figure for contingencies other than mortality. And that's the discount factor, if you remember from the schedule school on loss of earnings, that has to be applied to a loss of earnings claim in the future to reflect the fact that the claimant might have been unemployed or injured or have had some other mishap, even if they'd never had the accident. And the claim for, or the discount factor on future losses depends on employment status, age, sex, disability status at the time of the trial or the settlement. Now, suppose the discount factor in a particular case is 0.88, then the future claim is £48,000 times 0.88, which equals £42,240. And so the total loss of the fund at retirement 20 years from now is £42,240. That's the future loss of the fund, plus £7,200. That's the loss of the fund over the past 3 years, which amounts to £49,440. Bear in mind that that is a loss that will accrue 20 years in the future. So you have to apply a discount factor for accelerated receipt over 20 years, which is Ogden Table 35. And so it's 1.0513 times 49,440, which equals close on £52,000. You then have to give credit for any pension that you will receive in any event from pre-accident contributions, and any pension that you're likely to receive, taking into account your residual earning capacity after the accident, if there is any. And it may not be much in a serious injury case. So you can see that even on those quite modest figures, the claim for loss of defined contribution pension is fairly significant, and it can be over £100,000 in an appropriate case. So that's method one. I'll tell you about method two. Method two is where, when you've calculated loss of earnings in your loss of earnings claim, you have not discounted the loss of earnings to take into account the employee's pension contribution. So if that's how you've done it, that's fine. But if you think about it, you've already given the employee the benefit of a claim for loss of their contribution to the pension fund when you've calculated the loss of earnings claim. And if that's what you've done, then the only loss that remains when you calculate the loss of pension claim is what the employer was contributing separately, which in this case is 3% of £30,000 per annum. And if you go through the same exercise arithmetically as in method two, it centers around a loss of £900 past and future per annum. And when you've done the number crunching, you get a total claim of £21,762. And as against that, you have to give credit for any pension that has already been earned and which might be earned, taking into account your residual earning capacity.
So can you give an example of a defined benefit scheme then, David?
Okay, well, this is where it gets complicated and labour intensive. But I have to emphasise at this point that there is no shortcut, and you have to understand, according to the pension rules, what your client would have received by way of a final salary or defined benefit scheme. So let's take the example of the teacher's pension scheme, the TPS. And that's the example that will apply in Penny Foster's case, because of course she was a school teacher. Now this scheme mirrors a lot of public sector pension scheme in the way it's set up, namely civil service pension scheme, armed forces pension scheme. The way these schemes operate is broadly similar. The rules are a matter of statute, but they are summarized and explained in very user-friendly guides and videos on the particular public service website. So there are very helpful guides and videos on the TPS website. And personally, when formulating even the most complex claims for loss of pension, I have never had to look any further than the handouts and the guidance that is given to members via the website. So hopefully you won't have to look up statutes and statutory instruments, which are truly intimidating. Now, what you have to bear in mind is that in large part, people who are members of public sector pension schemes have been members of different sub-schemes of it over the years, because the government has moved generally from final salary schemes within the overall scheme to what's called career average schemes. So, and what that means is that until a certain point in time, the member of the relevant public sector scheme is accruing benefits, by which I mean entitlement to annual pension upon retirement under the final salary scheme. But there comes a point in time where they're moved into the career average scheme, and they continue to accrue benefits under the scheme, but according to different rules and different formulae. So most claimants who are teachers, and certainly Penny Foster in our case, as we will see, before a certain date would be a member of the final salary TPS, and until that date, their annual retirement rights would accrue according to the rules of the final salary TPS. After a certain date, they're a member of the career average TPS, and their annual entitlement accrues under those rules. So the rights that accrue under the final salary TPS work as follows. It's slightly different according to when the claimant joined the TPS, but I'm going to take the 1/80th example to illustrate this point. So a claimant who's been a member of the TPS from, say, the early 2000s will be a member of the final salary scheme, depending on what they decide, until at least April 2015. And what that means is that for every year that they are a member of the scheme, their annual pension entitlement builds as follows. It's 1/80th of whatever their final salary was on the last day of their membership of the final salary scheme, times the number of years that they've served up until that point. And that gives them their entitlement to their average salary at what is defined as the normal pension age under the final salary TPS, which in this case is age 60. Now that entitlement, if you like, crystallizes on the last day that they were a member of the final salary scheme. In many cases, that's April 2015. But that annual entitlement that's crystallized will grow according to the Consumer Prices Index, the CPI, and the pension provider will publish every year by how much the pension entitlement is growing according to the CPI. In addition to that, the claimant, as at the date of retirement, in this case 60 years old, gets 3 times their annual pension under the final salary TPS as a lump sum. And it's important to remember that different elements of the TPS give rise to different pension ages. So someone who's been a member of the final salary scheme until, say, April 2015 will start to get benefits under the final salary scheme at the normal pension age under that scheme, which is 60. Whereas once they go into the career average scheme, say after April 2015, they've got a different retirement age of equivalent to the state pension age, which might be 67 or 68, depending on their age. And so someone who's been a member of the final salary and also the career average scheme under the TPS will get a pension at age 60 and a pension when they finally retire at age 67 or whatever it is. So next slide, please, Alex, and I'll explain the TPS element by reference to a simple example. Now, suppose you've got someone who joins the final salary TPS scheme on the 30th of March 2015. That's their first day as a school teacher. Suppose that person moves to the career average scheme 3 years later in April 2015. At the point when she moves into the career average scheme and her final day of the membership of the final salary scheme, she's been a member of that scheme for 3 years. Now imagine at the point she leaves the scheme, she's earning 30,000 per annum. Her annual pension entitlement at age 60 under the final salary scheme is £30,000 divided by 80, multiplied by the number of years she was a member of that scheme, which is 3. So that gives her an entitlement of £1,125 per annum once she hits the age 60. But that is going to be uplifted by whatever the CPI is between now and her age 60. And in addition to that, she gets a lump sum at age 60 of 3 times her annual pension. So I hope that explains how the final salary element will have accrued in this notional example. So if you move to the next slide, Alex, we'll have a look at the career average scheme. So career average is where you accrue rights under the career average element of the scheme, not by reference to your final salary, but by reference to the earnings that you receive year by year. And under the career average scheme, every year that you earn a sum of money as a gross salary, 1/57th of that sum of money is added to your final annual pension entitlement. And that is added on to whatever entitlement you accrued in the previous year. But importantly, every year that your 1/57th of your salary for that year is added to your final entitlement, the whole lot is uplifted by 1.6% plus whatever the CPI, the Consumer Prices Index, is for that year. And the pension is then drawn or given to you at your normal pension age. And in the case of the career average TPS, this is equivalent to the state pension age. Now, if you just move on to the next slide, please, Alex, I'll try and explain that by reference to, again, what I hope is a simple example, but I can only make it so simple because the arithmetic can be quite complicated. Now, suppose our notional teacher joins the career average element of the TPS from April 2015, and she's a member for 3 years until March 2018. Suppose during those 3 years, she earns £30,000 a year. First year, her annual entitlement to pension, as at normal pension age, is £30,000 divided by 57, which is £526.32. That year, at the end of that year, roughly the 6th of April 2016, that's uplifted by 1.6% plus whatever the CPI happens to be that year. And the total of those two figures in this year is 2.8%. So the £526.32 she's accrued as at that year is uplifted by 2.8%. So her annual entitlement as at that year is £541.06. Next year, 2016-2017, she accrues another £526.32. That is added to the £541.06, which is already banked, as it were, in the annual pension entitlement. So her annual pension entitlement becomes £1,067.38. However, that total is again uplifted by 1.6% plus whatever CPI was that year. That year CPI was nothing. And so her uplift entitlement is £1,084.45. For the third year, the same exercise is done. 1/57 of 30,000. It's added to what she's already earned, and you get £1,610.77. That's uplifted by CPI plus 1.6%, which is 2.6%. And so the annual pension entitlement she's earned over 3 years is £1,652.66. Now, if she gives up being a teacher at that stage, March 2018, she gets that when she's age 67, which is, or whatever her normal pension age is, maybe 68, depending on her age. If, of course, she stays in the scheme until she's 67, 68, then for years after that, that figure of 1,652 is accruing very considerably. And so the scheme is nevertheless very generous to teachers. And as I've said at the beginning, in our case, I've calculated that even if 65 years old is assumed as Penny Foster's retirement, she would have accumulated an entitlement to £37,000 odd pension under the teachers' pension scheme, index linked. So it's still a very good deal for employees.
So for a defined benefit scheme, does the court take the same approach for the future growth of the fund and assume what it's going to be?
Absolutely, because there is nothing upon which the court will speculate. The court will assume that in the case of a career average TPS, the pension will increase according to whatever fixed rate of increase is contained within the rules. In that case, it's 1.6%. But insofar as the growth of the annual pension entitlement is dependent on a future index, which is not yet clear, such as the CPI, the court will simply not speculate on that. So if you ask a judge for a pensions report on public sector pension entitlement, in my experience, the judge will say, well, it's not necessary because we can work out what the pension entitlement would have been just by looking at the rules. So
again, will they admit the expert evidence on that?
Absolutely not. And I can't conceive of any case involving pension loss where the court would admit of expert evidence.
So how does one go about calculating the loss for a defined benefit scheme claimant?
Okay, well, the starting point is that you have to know how the scheme works in order to establish what the claimant's pension entitlement would have been up till trial and after trial. And this is where pension loss claims are more complicated than loss of earnings claims, because loss of earning claims, you know what the claimant was earning, what they're likely to have earned, or what they might have earned. You just have to work out the net equivalent of that. Loss of pension claims, you have to go back a stage and work out what their entitlement would have been under their pension scheme and what it will be now, to give credit for that when you reach your final figure. So as I say, to calculate what your client's earnings, pension would have been, and what they will be, there's rules, guidance, videos available on the scheme's website. Sometimes the claimant's own documentation can show what rights they've accrued to a certain point. So you can cross-check your calculations with that. Sometimes the websites give a pension calculator where you can key in years served, average salary, and work out a rough and ready estimate of what your pension will be. And again, that's a useful tool to cross-check that your calculations are going along the right lines. But unfortunately, there's no substitute for knuckling down and going through the arithmetic and working out what the pension entitlement would have been, but for the accident or the breach of duty, and by doing so by reference to the rules. So bear in mind that depending on the rules, there may be an entitlement to different pensions at different ages. For example, under the TPS, teacher might be entitled to a pension scheme at age 60 and then at retirement age. So that's going to involve two different income streams at 2 points in time and a split of the multiplier. Bear in mind that there will have been an accrual of pension rights, or would have been, but for the negligence or the breach of duty, there would have been an accrual of pension rights between the date of the breach and the date of trial or settlement. What that accrual is a matter of arithmetic looking at the rules. It is not discounted by a discount factor for contingencies other than mortality. However, when you're working out what your claimant's accrual of pension rights would have been, but for the negligence, between the date of trial or settlement and retirement, that is the accrual of future rights. And so you do have to discount the annual pension entitlement by an appropriate figure for contingencies other than mortality. Now, once you've done that, then you can work out what the claimant's gross annual pension entitlement would have been at retirement age. And sometimes, if it's a case such as TPS, at an earlier stage, say age 60, to reflect membership of a different part of the scheme. Now add to that the claimant's gross annual pension entitlement to the state pension, okay? And that will give you a gross figure of pension entitlement as at date of retirement. So next slide, please. So it's important, thanks Alex, it's important to work out the state pension entitlement as well, because you have to work out the overall net pension entitlement, taking into account the employment pension and the state pension to calculate your basic loss. So that total net figure will give you the multiplicand for the net pension loss as at retirement. And as I say, under some schemes, the claimant may be entitled to a pension at an earlier point in time, age 60, if they've been a member of the final salary teachers pension scheme. And so you then apply to that total multiplicand the relevant multiplier for pension loss at the different ages. And that can either be from a specific Ogden table. So if you can say, well, my pension would have kicked in at age 68, then there is a table for pension loss from age 68, or you can do it by reference to the life multiplier, less the relevant Ogden table multiplier to take you to that particular date. But by either method, you've got a multiplier now by which to multiply the multiplicand for pension loss. Work out, in addition to that, any loss of lump sum under the scheme. For example, a teacher who's been a member of the TPS final salary scheme, depending on when they joined, will be entitled to a lump sum at retirement age. Apply to that lump sum a discount factor for the period between the settlement and judgment and the date of receipt of that lump sum, and that comes from Ogden 35. And then you have a lump sum on a multiplicand basis of the claimant's annual pension entitlement that they would have enjoyed, and if relevant, a lump sum to reflect the loss of the lump sum at retirement, as they may have enjoyed, depending on what scheme they were a member of. And then you have to give credit for any residual net pension entitlements, calculated as a multiplicand basis, unless there are also lump sums to which the claimant would have been entitled as well, in which case you just add that lump sum onto the total. And by residual net pension entitlements, I mean any pension entitlements that accrued before the accident. Bear in mind, if someone's been a member of a defined benefit pension scheme before an accident, they'll still come into some entitlement when they hit retirement age anyway. Take into account future capacity to acquire future pension entitlement. As we'll see in the case of Penny Foster, we are assuming that she'll have some residual capacity of £10,000 earnings per annum, and that will give us some kind of build up of some kind of pension under a Pensions Act 2008 compliant defined benefit scheme. Forgive me, defined contribution scheme. Work out also what the claimant's state pension entitlement will be as things are. The net equivalent of all of that will give you an overall lump sum, which you subtract from the lump sum you've calculated for but for negligence annual pension loss and but for negligence annual pension lump sum entitlements. And that will give you your overall net figure. And as we'll see in the case of Penny Foster, I think from memory, I calculated that her bundle of entitlements, but for the accident, taking into account state pension, is something close on £1 million. But once you take into account her residual pension entitlement before the accident under the TPS, and her residual state pension, and her residual earning capacity, and the defined contribution pension to which that gives rise, the net loss is £670,000 odd. It's still a very significant sum.
Well, I look forward to seeing that in
yeah. Hence the need for two parts.
Thank you so much, Alex and David, for that. For me in particular, being talked through pensions one step at a time has been really helpful. In keeping with that, we have covered the principles today. We're going to go through the calculations next time, and there will be a separate worksheet for that. If you have any questions that arise out of today, please do feel free to message me, and I will feed those questions back to David and Alex at the beginning of our next session. Thank you so much.